Hello, bros. We're back with So the Witch Won't Eat Me, Fantasy and the Child's Fear of Infanticide by Dorothy Bloch. This lady kind of looks like Gundella the Witch. We're entering part 2 of the book, The Later Years. Chapter 8, A Worthless Child and a Noble Parent. Although I had always been impressed by a child's ability to create the defensive fantasy required in order to establish a minimal sense of safety, and with the aid of a psychoanalyst to allow it to evolve and play until its resolution, it was not until my analysis of Norma, who was referred at the age of 37 because of a severe neurotic depression, that I was able to understand the powerful role of a defensive fantasy that was not resolved in early childhood. The seeming absence of fantasy during latency had created the impression that it did not perform a continuing function. Norma's analysis revealed, however, that although with maturation her fear of being killed by her mother had been repressed along with the fantasy that it had required in early childhood, it remained the secret dynamic behind the unconscious fantasy that now dominated her life. Her insistence that there was something wrong with her came up with startling regularity in the course of her treatment and reflected the undefined hope that her worthlessness had caused her mother's hatred. Her mother's death some years before had in no way diminished the intensity of either Norma's despairing search for some explanation for the absence of her mother's love or of her own ceaseless struggle to win it. Only after the repeated exposure of her fantasy of eventually qualifying by perfecting her character and by doing good works was she able to experience her early terror of infanticide that the fantasy had concealed. After listening session after session to Norma extolling her mother's virtues, I commented on the perfection with which she endowed her. "The nobler I make her, the more understandable it is that she couldn't love me," was her reply. It came off the top of her head, and several years passed before it actually became part of her experience and her understanding. Norma's investment in feeling worthless was among the most dramatic I have encountered, as many other patients have also taught me since. The most convincing proof of her worthlessness was her murderous response to her mother's murderous feelings. Her need to believe that her mother felt only love for her required that she bury her perception of her mother's hostile feelings. Since that maneuver wiped out any foundation for her own hostility, she was left with the conviction that she was simply a worthless person who hated without reason. In order to maintain the illusion that her worthlessness had caused her mother's hatred, she designed a lifestyle based on self-defeat and failure. As her story unfolded, the efforts she had made to promote that conviction confounded belief. No significant area of her life had been permitted to contradict it by providing a sense of achievement that might have enhanced her self-esteem. That the stake involved in maintaining her fantasy was life or death was revealed at those moments when the fantasy was threatened. I soon learned to avoid any expression of either approval or disapproval in my treatment of her. Her response to approval was clear enough. Anyone's show of appreciation or affection for her would expose her mother's hatred. But disapproval? She coined a phrase I thought very apt when she referred to her extraordinarily heightened sensitivity to criticism as a mantle of virtue that she never permitted herself to discard. Any suggestion that she was less than perfect would have led to the exposure of her greatest imperfection, that she hated her mother and wanted to kill her. If that knowledge were allowed into awareness, it would inevitably have revealed that such feelings were merely a response to her mother's. Her system of self-deception would have been exposed, and her defense against her fear of infanticide shattered. She therefore sent out a distress signal at the merest breath of disapprobation, and avoided all clues and might have disclosed her own feelings or her mother's. Some years before, when her husband had asked for a divorce and left her with a daughter who was now 11, The resulting feelings of worthlessness were so overwhelming as to leave no room for the hope of ever establishing her worth. The suicidal thoughts that followed precipitated her entry into analysis for the first time. Now, once again, the violent attacks of her friend Ada had revived such thoughts. Under the barrage of Ada's criticisms, is this the first we've heard of Ada? Because I don't recall hearing about her. Just a weird introduction of Ada. Under the barrage of Ada's criticism, her defense against her perception of her mother's concealed wish to kill her had begun to crumble. At a point when she had relinquished almost all hope of being loved and was unconsciously contemplating suicide, she re-entered treatment. Looking back at my first impression of Norma, I remember being struck by her self-effacing, ingratiating facade and by what appeared to be an extraordinary confusion about her identity. She was a tall, dark-haired, somewhat heavy woman who appeared to have little awareness of either her intelligence or her charm, but seemed inundated with feelings of worthlessness. Although I found myself immediately responding to her unusual sensitivity, it wasn't until some time later that I was able to assess with any accuracy the degree of her terror and of her distrust. I suspect that she was preoccupied with suicidal thoughts, and when I suggested it after several months, she acknowledged it with relief. She had always known in a dissociated way about her wish for death. On an unconscious level, she was alarmed by it and had re-entered analysis in a blind drive for survival. When Norma was first referred to me, she was unaware of the nature of her problem. Despite some 5 years of analysis, both the manner and the content of her communications, however, revealed a severe neurotic depression. Through the density of a thick fog, which appeared to be carefully controlled in order to perpetuate a sense of confusion, she told me about her marriage and her divorce and her present friendship with Ada, which troubled her because of its homosexual overtones. It was not long, however, before she also introduced the hopeless riddle of her relationship with both her mother and her older brother Danny. Shortly after her treatment began, I became aware of her interest in writing and proposed that, to supplement her sessions, she might find it useful to write every day and make a copy for me. She seized on the suggestion and immediately embarked on an exploration of her relationships with her family from her earliest years. At first, she associated the sense of urgency with which she pursued this project with her feelings of extraordinary confusion about herself and her conviction that some buried memory could clear it all up. Later, she was amazed to hear herself state that, although she couldn't say what crime she had committed, she wanted to exonerate herself. The resulting record of her analytic experience is a valuable document that she has permitted me to use freely. Her initial sessions were mainly devoted to the daily barrage of criticism that Ada leveled at her. The blacker the charges, the more they gained Norma's attention. She was constantly involved in weighing their validity. When I finally stated, "You've put yourself on trial. If you find yourself guilty, you're in danger of doing away with yourself," she began to realize that she was engaged in a struggle for her life. It took some months before she found Ada's prototype in her mother. Although she was aware by now that she hated her mother, she hoped I would disprove it. She brought in a dream in which she saw her parents' flattened image in a concave mirror at Coney Island. Her comment was, "It's a distortion." She wanted them rehabilitated and their true image restored after the damaging effects of her previous analysis. Her mother had died a few years before and her father still earlier. Her brother, 4 years her senior, had terrorized her as a child and still had a crippling influence on her. There were 2 older sisters, one on the West Coast, who Norma thought had little effect on her life, and another whose hostility had been nearly as damaging to her as her brother's. There had also been a baby brother who had died of meningitis during infancy. Rounding out the picture of her family was her haunting awareness of her mother's miscarriages and stillbirths, thoughts of which continually hovered on the fringe of consciousness as though they contained some secret she dared not probe. As her sessions progressed, a picture emerged of a shabby, withdrawn child who had no memory of having been held or kissed or caressed by her mother. Her mother's disparaging comments about Norma were part of the daily routine. Although she had some early recollection of her father's warmth, all spontaneous show of affection on his part had stopped when she was 6 as a result of her mother's ridicule. The self deception that had wiped out Norma's perception of her mother's feelings was truly staggering. She was an unhappy child, but her central concern was her mother's unhappiness. The oppressive silence that usually prevailed when she and her mother were together invariably called up thoughts of her mother's tragic life, her mother's suffering, her nobility, and her martyrdom for her children were her constant preoccupation, and served as an ever present reminder of her own worthlessness. What confused her most was her mother's seeming ignorance of her brother Danny's violence. She related one abusive incident after another, but found it difficult to concede that her mother must have known of her terror, insisting her mother had warm feelings even though she didn't show them. Despite the evidence of real neglect, she presented she had never consciously allowed herself to think that her mother might have hated her. Norma's reverent attitude toward her mother, which her brother and sister shared, was complicated by her magical interpretation of an early event. During one session, her halting recital of her baby brother's death when she was 4 left her amazed that after 33 years it still appeared to be the tragedy of her life. When, acting on a hunch, I suggested that she thought she had killed him, she responded with surprised relief. She had always unconsciously considered herself a murderer. That preoccupation, however, surfaced only in her dreams. In one, she gave birth to a baby that she then presented to her mother. In another, she was wheeling an empty baby carriage across the street when she met 2 of her aunts. One was married to a man who was guilty of all kinds of chicanery in relation to Norma's father. The other was married to her father's scurrilous brother, who had repeatedly cheated him. Her comment in the dream was, "Who are you to accuse me?" In another dream, her mother is blind but leads Norma, who grasps the back of her dress and taps with a cane as though she, too, is blind. Norma commented, "I must not see what I see in deference to her handicap. She must be strong because I feel so small and weak." During the same session, she spoke of her fear as a child of going up to the roof alone to join the other children who lived in her building and played there. Although Norma had always regarded herself as a murderess, she now turned the charge against her mother. Her suspicion that her mother had never wanted children was confirmed when her brother had announced that a friend had just had her 4th child, and her mother had exclaimed incredulously, "She wanted them?" In the dream, Norma accused her mother of having aborted her children and having wanted to abort and kill her. It also soon became apparent that Norma's silence during childhood regarding her brother's violent attacks stemmed from her conviction that he was the agent of her mother's wishes. Her own comment, "I must not see what I see," expressed the self-deception she had practiced all her life. When I exposed her secret and told Norma what she knew at some level, that her mother had wanted to abort and to kill her, why the fuck would you tell this to your patient? Especially when you had no clue of what the mother was like. That she had been aware of this from her earliest years, and that she had likewise wanted to kill her mother. My disclosure was met initially by despairing acceptance. She wrote, "Tonight I'm assailed by all the old familiar feelings, the emptiness, the longing, the desolation. Life without love is surely the hardest thing to bear. Miss Bloch's interpretation leaves me feeling as stunned as though all of it were completely unknown to me. Suddenly things are beginning to clear. What I've always found unbearable is that I should have such horrible feelings about my blameless mother. Now that her destructive wishes are reinstated, I feel immensely relieved." By the next day, she felt overwhelmed by that insight and asked, "Is it possible that a mother wants to destroy her own child?" It wasn't long, however, before she rejected it outright. She accused me of trickery and deception, I agree, and the violation of all human feeling. Although she then appeared to accept it and welcomed the freedom to know what she knew, it was some time before she was able to experience and to understand the murderous wishes that lay beneath her preoccupation with her mother's virtue and the silence that usually prevailed between them. In the course of the next few months, Norma's analysis revealed the system of self deception that had originated with her mother's feelings, but extended to all her relationships. Although one part of her took careful note of the evil and the hostility that she encountered, another automatically repressed all awareness of it. Since this process left her own responses unexplained, she was frequently overwhelmed by her own hostility and her resulting feelings of worthlessness. It waited for an incident relating to her husband to bring into focus both the operation of this process and its dynamics. One day, following her separation, Ada had tried to suggest in a gingerly fashion that there were sordid aspects to her husband's character that Norma's manner had led Ada to believe were completely hidden from her. They were both surprised when Norma proceeded to enlarge on her outline. An entry in her journal records the incident and the insight that followed. She wrote, "To know and not to know, a process by which I erased my perception of evil in others. All that I knew had not prepared me for Ada's revelation, and it took some months before what I knew and what I knew began to come together. I had been defending myself against something I wouldn't define, just as some years ago I had known that in order to survive I had to stay away from my mother without acknowledging I felt she wanted to kill me." That last sentence startled and shocked Norma and finally led to the exposure of her system. She wrote, "Suddenly something seems to have opened up that I don't want to go near. This process, which has become so much a part of me, is the result of a daily confrontation with knowledge I didn't dare let myself know. It hadn't occurred to me until this moment that a precedent had already been established for the feelings that existed between my husband and me. The measureless rage and the wordless guilt belonged to my mother. Her system of self-deception was designed not only to enhance her image of others, but to diminish her own. When she finally allowed herself to perceive Ada's destructive character, she became aware that she had no idea of her own identity. When I stressed the difficulty of finding it at her age, she felt relieved. She later described an experience related to her ensuing search for it. "I woke up with a start and a feeling I had been dreaming about my brother Danny. Ada suddenly popped into my head, and the clear awareness that she hated me. I had no feeling of anguish or grief, just a crystal clear realization that it was true, that on one level I've tried to conceal it, and on another to work ceaselessly to overcome it. Suddenly I saw it and felt no anxiety. Apparently, first it's necessary to find someone who feels as ambivalent and destructive towards me as Danny or my mother. Then I search my soul to discover what there is in me to provoke such feelings. I concentrate on my faults to explain away the hatred and also to maintain hope. The fantasy, I think, has been that if I can be a better person, I will no longer provoke such feelings, and I will be loved. It seems so simple. Now I see that once I remove myself as the cause of other people's hatred, I can begin to live. Finding my own identity then becomes a very different experience. At some points in the past months, I recognized the absurdity of my fantasy. It was a child's dream. You'll see. I'll be good. I'll be very good. And then you'll love me." In order to preserve her self-image of worthlessness, she had also developed a technique that she called the sifting process, a method of screening out from any experience, no matter how positive, some particular detail with which she could attack herself. As she explained it, a moment's exuberance could seem shockingly inappropriate and provide the ammunition for endless self-flagellation. In addition, she permitted no significant area of her life to provide a sense of achievement that might increase her self-esteem. When she began to examine her efforts to establish her worthlessness, she enumerated instance after instance that clearly indicated her unusual abilities, and at the same time her enraged rejection of other people's recognition of them. Her need to maintain a diminished self-image was still so great that even now this unprecedented admission of worth was followed by a strong reaction. She wrote, I've had a strange sensation in writing this. I feel I'm not telling the truth. A counterpoint of mockery on a nonverbal level accompanies everything I write. I know that everything is absolutely true, but I don't believe it. Although I was already thoroughly familiar with the phenomenon of resistance in psychoanalytic treatment, I don't think anyone taught me more than Norma about either the dimensions of the investment in remaining dependent or its meaning. At a stage where a great deal of the debris that had cluttered up her life had already been cleared away, freeing her to move forward, Norma suddenly evinced absolutely no intention of budging, beating a retreat at the slightest recognition of her creativity. One day she brought her latest painting in to show me. This was not the first time I had seen her work, which I found very impressive, and I took this opportunity to express my genuine feeling. My praise apparently inspired her when she arrived home to confront what struck her as an extraordinary concept. She had talent. She spent hours delving into the history of her system of self-deception that had been designed to conceal it. To her amazement, this was then followed by complete numbness. I don't know, that made me laugh. And inactivity. She felt paralyzed. During her next session, she got the first inkling of the real meaning of her avoidance of achievement. Although many patients have ascribed to their fear of failure their reluctance to attain or even to define a goal, Norma's experience reinforced an already strong impression that in many instances, the more corrosive and inhibiting factor may be the fear of success. It has been recognized that success may precipitate acting out in a suicidal patient, but it has not been so apparent that passivity, the stifling of creativity, the inhibition of effort, or the blunting of aspiration may simply express an unconscious determination to avoid exposing the system of self-deception and risking being killed. The terror that took over with the first tentative steps towards accomplishment exposed the nature of the conflict. Norma's analysis revealed that buried in her unconscious was the conviction that achieving success meant risking death. Not only would her mother's hatred of her be exposed if she established her worthiness to be loved, but also the fantasy that it was her worthlessness that had provoked it. The hope of eventually winning her mother's love, her primary defense against her fear of being killed by her, would have collapsed. Not only would achievement expose the reality of her mother's hatred by enhancing Norma's self-esteem, however, it would also threaten her concept of how to win love, since being herself had elicited only hatred. She had unconsciously concluded that to win love, she had to wipe herself out. Another patient once stated, if I'm me, nothing will work. And yet, another, I became someone else so I would be liked. Many had avoided relationships rather than meet such requirements. With Norma, this concept emerged with particular clarity in her relationships with men. She had reported becoming aware of a strange kind of lethargy throughout her married life, a loss of all feeling of volition that affected both intellectual pursuits and even the memory of any creative interest. At a later point, when her overwhelming discouragement about ever finding a man had momentarily decided her to end the search, she was astonished by what followed and wrote, a cloud seems to have lifted, a weight which has kept me paralyzed. I now see that for me, finding a man means relinquishing all interest and condemning myself to mindlessness, the price of being loved. No wonder I regarded it as hopeless. If I had relinquished any more, I would have been dead. With Saul, I gave up everything that meant anything to me. I repeated with him what I had learned from my family was the requirement for winning love. It hadn't occurred to me that it still permeated my life. As soon as I decided to stop looking, I was all energy. I could do what I wanted, go where I pleased. There's still something, though, that doesn't want to believe any of this, that wants to think it's phony. And that's the part that wants to keep me paralyzed. Perhaps if I expunge enough of myself, for Norma, as for many patients, the problem of identity was complicated by still another factor. She was convinced that a precondition for winning love was not only expunging herself, but remaining dependent. The memory of being cared for in the early years was her only experience of being loved. She therefore ascribed its loss to growing up and being independent and yearned for a return to that early state. By maintaining the illusion of helplessness, she had tried magically to revive her only experience of her mother's love, her physical care during infancy and childhood. She wrote, "What has always infuriated me when I've been praised is the fear of what would follow, the declaration of my independence. I would no longer be considered a candidate for loving care. I've never believed in my wish for dependence. Now suddenly it explains a major part of my life. Dependence has been the price of love." Another thought occurs: dependence and lack of identity are intertwined. This revelation led her to conclude, until now, all my efforts were expanded with only one end in view: to win love, and in particular my mother's, a truly hopeless project. For over 3 decades, I've concentrated on meeting what I felt must be the requirements, and now at 39, I'm faced with the bitter knowledge that I've never known it. The examination of the relationships within her family, inspired by this last insight, led her directly into the realm of homosexual feelings. Although she recognized that these feelings expressed her search for love, she was mainly preoccupied with what she considered their abnormality and spoke with great difficulty. After listening to her unyielding insistence that she was responsible for her mother's hostile feelings, I finally made an interpretation that dramatically revealed her enormous stake in maintaining her system of self-vilification. I stated, "The only thing wrong with you is your determination to believe that everything is wrong." The violence of her reaction paralleled her response to my statement concerning her mother's wish to kill her. Again, she accused me of manipulating and trickery. This time I was trying to conceal from her that she was really a homosexual. What? Her eventual acceptance of my statement was followed by black despair. If nothing was wrong with her, all hope was lost. She wrote, "I can't believe what's happened, but some part of me has already understood, and the rest waits in a state of wonder. I'm not sure if I can recall Bloch's exact words, although I remember telling her she ought to make a tape recording of them, instead of repeating them what seemed like a dozen times. I know I felt stunned. Finally, she made me repeat, 'My feelings are completely normal. My problem is I think everything that has to do with me is wrong.' They plunged me into a sea of desolation. Once more I was sure she was trying to mislead me, and I interpreted this completely new diagnosis as an attempt to deflect my attention from what I concluded must be a really hopeless homosexual problem. 36 hours and a severe migraine later, and I'm beginning to entertain the possibility that she really meant what she said. Whatever is right. It seems too wonderful." What the fuck is going on here? Suddenly she's just a homosexual. All right, I'm stopping there because this babbling horseshit. Surprised that Bloch didn't ask her if she wanted to make love to her like she asked a 6-year-old. But we'll conclude there for now. Goodbye, bruv. Goodbye.